What's up everyone, my name's MarkHawk and today we're doing a quick side-by-side with the Sony 4K X1000V action camera up against the GoPro Hero4 Black edition running the latest 2.0 firmware. Now we're taking these guys out of the dry Los Angeles mountains and we're going to see how they perform in some snow and ice up at Big Bear Mountain. So let's get out there. Yeah. Now you can use any of these quick links to jump to the section you're most interested in. There's a lot of features to cover, so sit back and we'll start playing them all. Now, if any of this footage looks familiar and you've watched one of our other comparisons, it's because we're filming with 4 cameras at the same time to get more done, so let's get to it. So unless otherwise stated, a lot of the footage you guys will be seeing today is shot in 4K. Now, if you want to see what resolutions and frame rates and settings are being used, check the upper part of the screen, it's going to have all of that information. Now here we're filming at 4K wide, 30 frames a second, and basically getting the max quality we can out of both of these cameras. With the Sony X1000V, that's 4K at 100 megabits a second, and with the Hero4 Black, that's 4K at about 60 megabits a second. So each of these cameras has their own color space option. Now with the Sony, we're looking at its vivid color space, and what that's doing is it's crunching down the blacks and the whites pretty hard, and then we're also adding a cool tint on top of that. And since we are crunching down so hard, we're getting a lot of sharpness, but then we're also just having a lot of sharpness coming in just from the original recording. Now when we switch to the GoPro Hero 4, it's filming with the GoPro color grade, and it's got kind of a softer quality to its footage. Now we are crunching those whites and those blacks down, but not nearly as much, so we do retain a lot more of that information, and then we're adding kind of a warmer tint on top of that. Now, if you look towards the center of those mountains, we'll zoom in here. If you look towards the center of those mountains, we have a lot more detail on the Sony X1000V. If you look at the snow and the trails going in between the trees and everything like that, everything from the foreground to the far background, it's much sharper on the X1000V. The Hero 4 just has this sort of softness and muddiness. It's definitely not bad, but you look at it compared to the X1000V and it looks like a huge step up. But since we are crunching those white and those black levels down so much, we are losing some of that information on the Sony X1000V. We start to sort of overexpose our image a little faster, but again, I think it looks great, and I think the color tone on the Hero 4 Black looks great, but it comes down to personal preference on which colors you kind of like. So if we look at something with a little more color, you really notice what the X1000V is doing to the footage right away. And the same with the Hero 4 Black. The Hero 4 Black almost looks like it's filming in a flat color mode, but in reality the Sony X1000V is maybe adjusting its white balance a little bit to make a more appealing image. So those rocks in the background on the X1000V are not really yellow, they're more of a whitish color. And then you'll notice my car and my pants are just super amped up. It's somewhere in between those two. Now with the Hero 4 Black, we have a lot of filming options. We can film in 1440p like we are here right now, and that gives us some extra top and bottom space without really adding a ton of lens distortion. The Sony X1000V really only has one way to change the field of view, and that's to enable steady shot. Now the one big downside to this is that you are sacrificing quality of footage, so you can't film at 100 megabits a second, you have to film at 60 megabits a second, and then turn on steady shot. There's no way to change the angle for footage, unfortunately, and it's a real big oversight in my opinion. Now with the Hero 4 Black, we can turn on super view, and that's a little wider than Sony's default sort of wide angle lens, but it adds a little bit of distortion because we're taking that sort of 4:3 1440p information we had before, and we're sort of squishing it down into a 16:9 format. So while we have more information here, it's a little bit distorted, and you can have some lens distortion when you're sort of rotating left and right. Not so much when you're going forward or up and down, but if you're tilting up and down, you're going to have a lot of lens distortion on both of these cameras when you're in that super view mode or when you're in Sony's default view. One of the main reasons why I wanted to film at a snow resort is because you can run into a lot of issues. You have this very bright reflective material, and then you have people sort of jumping and interacting right on top of it. Your camera has to find a good dynamic range in the middle to make an appealing image. So sometimes that can make your image seem kind of flat or kind of dark because it's trying to underexpose itself for how bright the environment actually is. It's really hard for a camera to compensate, especially when you're moving around a lot. So we'll start off with some static stuff here, and you can kind of see both cameras have a good dynamic range. The Hero 4 Black isn't crunching out the trees in the background nearly as much, but the Sony X1000V, the snow on the ground looks amazing. It's super sharp. It's just got a crisp and a sort of crunch that I really like. Hero 4, it just has this tendency to feel like I'm filming in a neutral mode, especially when the sun is right in the shot. And I don't have this issue when I'm taking photos, but some of the video here just kind of looks a little washed out. However, when you turn the camera away from the sun, the GoPro has this really appealing sort of color palette, but the Sony X1000V's color palette right now is probably closer to what I saw on the day. My jacket is more of that blue and orange color. It's not so much of that teal and sort of reddish orange. Again, I just think the Sony X1000V has a really good color palette for especially snow sports, just because it's a nice cooler temperature. But the Hero4 Black looks really nice during this sort of golden hour sunset. I just feel like there's a hint of green, especially if you're looking at those clouds in the horizon line. It's just they're not as white, but there's actually more detail in them now that I'm looking at it than the X1000V. You don't really even see the clouds in the X1000V because of how much we're crunching sort of the white and the black levels. You can see a good amount of detail in the back of my jacket too. You can see kind of where I probably have a few scuff marks and stuff on it, but overall the image just feels so much softer compared to the X1000V. So this next clip is sort of a preview to our audio test, but just keep some of the things I said in mind and I'll hop back in a second here. Back to audio more thoroughly in a little bit, but you kind of notice the Hero4 Black has a sort of muffled sound while the Sony X1000V is much louder and cleaner. Both of these cameras aren't in a case, and when we get to the next section, you'll actually see how they're mounted. So again, we have both of these cameras looking at a very bright source. We have them looking at the side of a mountain with the sun coming down towards it with their default color grade. The X1000V again has a lot of detail in that snow. You see a lot more of the sort of trails left behind between skiers and snowboarders, while the Hero4 Black, a lot of that detail gets lost. It kind of looks like we're kind of in a flat color mode, and we kind of feel like we're slightly darker than the image on the left here. We're not doing anything to the footage in post, and both of these cameras are filming at their highest bitrate possible. So with the X1000V, that's 100 megabits at 4K, and with the Hero4 Black, that's 60 megabits at 4K. And just the softness in the trails that we're not really seeing that we are seeing on the X1000V is kind of surprising, because the Hero4 Black has kind of dominated sort of sharpness comparisons for me for a while. So what we're doing here is we're switching over to the flat color space, because I wanted to see if we were losing that information in the Hero4 Black. Now I'm seeing those trails in the Hero4 Black, and I'm just wondering if the way the Pro Tunes color grade is crunching everything down is we're just not seeing them, because the information is there, we're not losing it, but things do seem a little softer still. So I wanted to quickly point out one of my bigger concerns with the X1000V, and that's the amount of lens distortion on the left and right side of the screen. Now, we don't really have any field of view options like we do on the Hero to kind of go to a more medium field of view, so it's something we're kind of always having to deal with. And in my experience, it was only really noticeable when you were sort of rotating left and right. If you look at the sides of the screen here, you'll notice the mountains kind of warp and distort as I spin rather heavily. And again, when you're sort of tilting up and down, think of it as sort of a tripod movement. But when I was cruising down the mountain and stuff like that, it never really bothered me. So it's really just those sort of left and right movements and up and down movements, but we don't really have any control to fix them unless we switch to steady shot. The only downside to steady shot, and you might have heard me say it before, is we actually have to go to a lower bitrate quality of footage, which is kind of upsetting, but steady shot has its own advantages. So on the left side of the screen here, we have the Sony camera running 1080p with its steady shot on, and on the right we have the Hero4 Black. Again, both of these are 60 frames a second, so there should be a much less amounts of motion blur. But you notice when we have steady shot enabled, when we're doing these small sort of panning things, it's much nicer, much smoother. But the Sony X1000V has a better sort of steady shot now. It's better with dealing with micro vibrations, so sort of that shakiness for when we're going downhill snowboarding, or if you mount it on your bike, it should be able to handle those a lot better. It's not going to do any miracles, but it does add. I mean, you're looking at these side by side right now. The X1000V is just nice and smooth. The only sort of noticeable hitch is you're going to have some sort of warpiness in the corners, which is only really noticeable if you're looking out for them. but you'll also have these sort of jagged movements every now and then as the camera sort of like shifts left, shifts right, and all this is sort of digital stabilization. It's nothing optical. The lens itself isn't actually moving. This is also a sort of a good zone to look at sort of the contrast. If you look on the X1000V, the mountains on the right just completely washed out, while the Hero4 Black still retained a lot of that data. Again, we're still filming steady here. I'm just hand holding this, and X1000V does pretty good. If you're watching the Hero4 Black, you notice it's sort of bobbing and weaving around. The X1000V will just have these sort of moments where it just quickly sort of like what's the word? Kind of like jaggies. It kind of like jumps real quick, a few pixels left and right. It's actually pretty apparent here as we're going straight down. You'll notice it'll just sort of bump up, down, and stuff like that. The reason why we're filming at 60 frames a second again is to reduce some of that motion blur that we'll see, and it'll reduce some of the smearing that we'll see when the camera is trying to stabilize itself. Now both of these cameras have a ton of frame rate options. They just keep stacking and stacking the amount of options on. With the Hero4 Black, they actually put out a firmware update 2.0, which we have installed here, which will actually allow us to do 240 frames a second at 720p in a narrow field of view. And the Sony X1000V out of the box can do 240 frames a second at 720p as well, but it can actually do it in a wide field of view. Now, we're not really looking at 240 frames a second because with both of those cameras, there are minor issues I'm trying to work around, so we're just going to stick with looking at 120 frames a second, which is basically 4 times slowed down. However, at some point we'll swing back around to 240 frames a second. You can click this box on your screen right now if you want to jump to that real quick. And I also should mention that the steady shot that we looked at before is not available at 4K on Sony's line of the camera, and the GoPro Hero4 Black doesn't have any type of steady options.
You know, when we came here, they told us we could only play for 30 minutes today. I know. I changed my guitar strings, I did all kinds of stuff, and they're saying, I think we just about hit 30 minutes right now. What should we do? I'm good with 30. No, I think we're gonna play a few more, man. Maybe life is like a ride on a freeway, launching bullets while you're trying to find a way. Everyone's around me, no one does a damn thing, it brings me down. But I won't act that if I say it breaks. Better you be correct, and if I don't speak, it's cause I can't disconnect, but I won't be. Burn a bottle of reflection of the fire in your eyes as you're staring at the sun.
Alright, the GoPros are both filming in Super View mode for the GoPro Hero4 Silver. That's 1080p. Super mode, 30 frames a second. For the Black, that's 2.7K Super, 30 frames. Both in their GoPro color grade, and the Sonys are at their default, same as before, so 4K or 1080 in their color mode and their default lens width. So nothing overly surprising about that test. It's kind of on par with what we listened to earlier. Voices come through really good and stuff like that, but the Hero just has a tendency to sound kind of muffled. And if you're worried about the X1000V sounding too loud, especially if you do a lot of racing or you're going to have a lot of wind noise, it has options to kind of reduce that. And Hero has some options themselves that you can use to adjust the sound quality. Now that sort of GoPro color grade where it adds that sort of warmer tint, where it has that sort of slight green in the whites, it really helps during golden hour. It just makes things around this time of the day look great. Now if we hop over back to LA, we have a lot more color in the buildings, we have some green grass, which is a weird thing to say about LA, but there's actually a lot of it in this scene, and if you look at the clouds and stuff like that, it's not as crunched as the X1000V, and what I mean by that is like our whites aren't as bright. But we have a ton of cloud detail in there on the Hero Black. We have a ton of color on the side of the building and stuff like that. The X1000V, if we weren't filming in flat mode and we wanted to adjust some of these colors, it would be a little more restrictive. But, you know, if you guys are on par with me, I think the X1000V is coming along, is looking pretty good. Just the sharpness of those palm trees and stuff like that, the city in the background, like look at the outline of the city on the X1000V, it looks great. The Hero4 Black is kind of muddy and stuff, and maybe the X1000V is doing some things that aren't how it actually appears, but it's still producing a really nice and appealing image. Like this sunset here looks great. We still have a ton of cloud detail. The kind of wide angle lens is a little too wide for me. Again, I wish I could just change the angle like I could on the AS30 back in the day, but just jumping from that last image to this image, you can definitely see sort of the green tints and the white and stuff like that, but super awesome looking image, and really glad I was able to capture this. As we start to head into more of the nighttime sort of landscape, the Hero4 Black's color palette here maybe has a slight edge, because I feel like the X1000V is brighter and there's more information there, and these images aren't really synced up that well, obviously, as I pop my head in there. But again, it's really just a personal preference when it comes to color. Both of these guys right now are doing a fantastic job, but look at the railing. There's so much more detail in the X1000V and the chip paint and stuff like that. In the trees in the background. Just see all the individual branches. You can see a more dynamic range in there and stuff like that. It's pretty cool. This is another really good shot to take a look at the clouds in the sky. The Hero4 Black. We're seeing a lot more variation in the clouds and stuff like that. Again, if we wanted to adjust the color, we have the option to do that here. The X1000V, it's kind of blowing out those whites quite a bit, but both of these images look fantastic. Sharpness on X1000V, I feel like I'm a broken record, I keep repeating myself. But man, this Boulder Bay area is like just looks so nice. Now, Sony uses a backlit image sensor for its cameras, which usually gives it a big advantage when filming in low light to nighttime scenarios. The GoPro Hero4 Black is using actually a Sony image sensor for its camera, but it doesn't sort of have the same effect in low light. So we're going to jump to night here in a minute, and the settings I've been using on the Hero4 Black has been 24 frames a second with an ISO of 1600. Now the reason why I'm choosing the ISO at 1600 is because it severely reduces the amount of grain we see. However, it does make the image darker, but I do feel it's a more appealing image, and I turn it to 24 frames a second to allow the most amount of light possible into the camera. So right now on the right we have the Hero4 Black with all the settings I just mentioned. And on the Sony, we have only the default settings. Now, there isn't a huge difference here, but at 24 frames a second on both of these cameras, we're actually letting in a lot of light. If there's really nothing you can see here with the naked eye when we are sort of standing here. There is a good amount of reflection and stuff like that, but that is just sort of us for taking the time to get a little extra light in the camera. You can see with the 1600 ISO here, we do have little big chunks of grain. We had grain in the Sony camera here, but if you look at that sky in the upper left, you see a sort of a dancing noise pattern there. It's pretty heavy. But if we were to turn that to the ISO to 6400, what it's at default, we get a brighter image, but there's just a ton of noise. And maybe when we're in these sort of blackout conditions, it might not bother you as much, but if we're sort of, let's say, in a city condition, which we'll jump to in a second, that grain's going to get all over the place, and it's going to kind of ruin your image. At least with the ISO at 1600, we could use something like Neat Videos, a degrainer, and just sort of reduce the grain on a bunch of our plates. So here we'll again switch back to the ISO to 1600 for the Hero Black on the right. We're going to stay at 24 frames a second for both of these cameras. Again, just allowing as much light as possible to get to that image sensor before the shutter closes. At 24 frames a second, I feel like both of these cameras are doing a pretty good job. Honestly, if I wasn't labeling these, I feel like we might have a hard time distinguishing which is which. The Hero4 Black just has a sort of distinct grain to it that kind of is kind of compression-y, and that's really my only major complaint here. But yeah, I think both of these do pretty well in these sort of low light to night conditions. I generally find the Sony X1000V, in my opinion, and experience to be more reliable with low light, because you'll notice here the sky here is a little darker, but it doesn't always look as good as this. We just happen to have a lot of light in this sort of nighttime scenario. And again, if we turn it to 6400 ISO, we get more information, but we get a bunch more grain. It looks a little more artifacty and kind of lower quality. So one thing that bugs me to have to bring up again another year in a row is how the Sony camera handles its time-lapse photos. it's not giving us high quality stills similar to the GoPro Hero4 Black. The GoPro Hero4 Black will give us 12 megapixel stills, identical to the ones that it takes when you do normal still photography. The X1000V will actually give you these 1920 by 1080 600 kilobyte files that are just much lower quality than what it takes when it's just doing regular still photos. So it's kind of a shame, but it allows you to have the option to have the camera build your photo sequence for you. But then if you want to go build the sequence yourself later, it doesn't change the name of the stills compared to the sequence. So if you have 100 sequence photos and then take one still or two stills or three stills, it's going to have the same name and numbers right afterwards. The Hero4 Black at least will add a 1 or a 2 to the first number in the sort of 4 segments. That way it kind of distinguishes what is your time-lapse or what is a new time-lapse if you want to do multiple time-lapse in a day. It's a lot more organized and easier to use. But if we're just talking about regular still photography, both of these cameras' photos are great. I can be nitpicky about certain aspects of it that I don't like. I generally prefer the Hero4 Black having the more top and bottom field of view. I like the chrome contrast here in some of these stills of the headlights on the X1000V. But for the most part, the photos you're getting out of both of these cameras are fantastic, especially for the size. They fit in your pocket. You know, you don't have to put your cell phone in danger. And both of them have built-in Wi-Fi with extremely fast ways of transferring the photos to your phone. So if you get to be the passenger on the drive home, you can just transfer all the photos to your phone, upload them to Instagram, Facebook, whatever you want. The one big advantage the Hero4 Black has is you can actually control the shutter speed, which you're kind of seeing animate here. So from low light, we can actually have it go from auto to do 2 seconds, to do 5 seconds, and then you can do 60 seconds. You can do a bunch of nighttime sort of stills of the starry skies and stuff like that. You can get some amazing results that you can't do with the X1000V. You can only do with the Hero4 Black. And if you just remember that sort of pitch black lake we had before, just check out the Hero4 on the right here. This is just putting a 10-second exposure on it. We can get so much more information. It's a beautiful image. Some of the nighttime photography stuff you can do with the Hero4 Black is pretty amazing. Anyway, that's going to wrap up our comparison of these two cameras for now, but there's still a ton more to cover, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on any videos. Also, be sure to check me out on Instagram or Twitter if you want to see what we're up to next. We're going to have a ton more content coming up soon. And also, if you guys are feeling generous, hop on over to my Patreon page. We're going to be throwing up a video soon. But yeah, it's just mainly to get more content, because all of MarkHawkCam is run out of pocket. Very rarely do we get sent stuff, so the more you continue to support me, the more videos I can make for you guys. So, I'm MarkHawkCam, and I'll see you guys out there. Have a good one.